I'll have a little chat.
Yeah.
Well, I've been listening to DVDs and iPod and all that kind of stuff for months, and I have real trouble getting past the anger that I have, and underneath that I know I've got a lot of sadness under there.
Yeah.
But to try to get under it, I'm finding it so hard because, I was listening to another DVD was saying to go bash stuff outside, so I go hit a tree for a few hours or something, but it doesn't get to anywhere.
Yeah.
And I don't know, is there I'm not really sure where to go with it, or how to take it further.
All right, it's a good question. A lot of people have trouble with their anger, so if we recognise that underneath anger is usually fear, not grief. So, and then underneath the fear is generally grief. So, for many of us, the reason why we're in anger is because we're actually quite afraid about something, and we're not acknowledging the fears that we actually have in the moment, and we want to feel powerful instead. So we go into this angry place rather than staying in the place where we allow ourselves to feel our terror and fear. So what I do personally is when I'm in anger, firstly I notice that I have this anger, whatever the anger is about. A lot of times it's about like somebody not loving me or caring about me in a certain situation. So what I do then is I go, all right, so I'm angry about that. What am I afraid of here? And usually what I do is pray a lot about what am I afraid of, just wanting to discover what I'm afraid of. The problem for most of us is that we try to skip over our fear and get to the grief like that. And the way you are built is that you can do that. And people do that quite regularly, where they skip over their fear and go into grief. But the fear is this fear-based emotions are what I would call a heap of blocks to actually feeling your emotions in a very natural way. So if you try to skip over your fear to get to your grief, you find every time some issue comes up, you'll be trying to skip over fear with every issue. It's far better to actually go through the fear itself and experience the fear itself. And when you experience the fear, there'll be usually tears associated with fear, but also your body will shake. You'll feel quite sick a lot of times inside, particularly around the diaphragm, midsection of your body. And if you allow yourself to feel that fear inside of you and just experience it, what happens is after a while you'll release most of the fear that you have. And so what happens then when a trigger comes along, instead of your fear being triggered, I want to avoid the fear so I'm straight into anger, what happens is the trigger comes along and the fear isn't automatically felt because there's not much fear left. And as a result, you can get to the deeper grief quite rapidly without automatically reverting to anger. The second thing is that because we have this fear, and we're not allowing ourselves perhaps at the moment to see the fear itself, what we finish up doing is we finish up sort of living in the fear to a degree, and that attracts a whole group of spirits around us who are also in fear of usually the same thing we're in fear about. And because of now, so not only now have I got my own blocking resistance to feeling my grief, but now I've got a heap of mates hanging on my shoulders, if you like, all also in the state where they are trying to block the grief as well with inside of themselves, and therefore they want to help you get out of yours. And so what happens is the fear itself has now attracted a whole group of other people in fear, and now my penchant for going into anger is going to be much greater again. So if we can allow ourselves to see that fear is something that does need to be processed, it's not something you can skip over on the divine love path. On the natural love path, what we finish up doing generally with fear is we start rephrasing things into different places. So we say, oh, this happened to me, but it's all good, isn't it? And those kind of statements we make. And we reframe the fear. What we want to do instead with the fear is actually to allow ourselves to feel it bodily. So if you find yourself getting into anger a lot, the key is to pray a lot about fear. That'll help you a lot to not get into the rage itself. When you're prepared to feel fear, that's when you actually finish up not getting into anger anywhere near as much. It's our desire to get away from our fear that causes us to act in an angry manner or to connect mostly with anger. Does that make sense? Yeah. So most of us have large fears. As men, we have a tendency to not recognise our fears, usually more than women, because fear and being masculine are like for many people, it's like two opposite things, you know. As a man, we're taught to never show our fear, really, to never be afraid. Now, a woman is generally allowed to be afraid, so she's allowed to have her fear generally, but for many women, they don't allow themselves to experience their fear deeply, and so for many women, there's also the tendency to get into anger as a result of avoiding their fear too. Generally, we're pretty much all made up a very similar way, and that is that when we avoid our fear, anger usually is the only result. There are other suppressing emotions above anger though. So above anger, we often, and this happens for many women in particular, men generally are allowed to express anger. That's sort of viewed as a masculine emotion, although it's not anything to do with masculinity. It's viewed as a masculine emotion, so many men are allowed to feel their anger, but many women are not allowed to even feel their anger. And so that's the time when we go into complete suppression of our emotions, which is depression. And that's why there is a much higher likelihood if we're a female to have depression than there is if we're male to have depression. Because depression is the actual suppression of anger, which is the suppression used to suppress our fear. So every one of these steps is like in our own feelings is like a more powerful place, but from God's perspective, it's actually making us weaker and less connected with ourselves. And it's all, in the end, just done to avoid the grief. So you're correct in saying there's grief there within you can feel, but allow yourself to look at the fear, what the fear is that's over the top of that grief. It is quite hard to get to the fear. You're dead right. It is quite difficult. And it requires a lot of honesty with yourself to actually look at your fears. Because a lot of the times we feel... we can admit, oh, well, I'm sad about this particular event in our childhood, I'm sad about that particular event. But it's very, very hard to admit even to ourselves some of our fears, because some of our fears are actually so childlike that we don't, as adults, even want to admit that we have them. To give you an example, most of your emotions are locked up at the age or frozen in time at the age they were created. So let's say at 3 years of age, you had, say, your mother yelling at you. So she's obviously, she's this much taller than you at 3 years of age. She's over the top of you like this. So if you imagine you're down here looking up at this angry person who's just like red, often in the process spirit influenced, and as a child we can often see that occurring as well. And we're just sitting there trembling because mum's yelling at me. We don't even hear what mum's yelling at me about. Most of the time we're just in this terrible interaction with her where we're just feeling all this barrage of anger and rage coming from her, and we're this little child who does not know what's going to happen next. We might get violently punished, and for many of us we have had that happen as a part of this rage. And so we're there as a little child feeling that emotion. Now that emotion, if I'm not allowed to experience that fear completely, will get locked up inside of me at that age. So it'll be a 3-year-old's feeling of fear. So now imagine I'm growing up as an adult male. I'm maybe 6 foot tall or whatever. Most of the women around me are shorter than me, and I've got much more physical power than most of the women. And yet, whenever a woman goes into rage, I go into terror. And all I'm actually doing is acting out the little 3-year-old locked up emotion. And so for many of us, we don't want to admit to ourselves that we're like a little 3-year-old in that particular situation. And particularly with my mum, who might be still alive. So whenever my mum gets angry, I go into this little 3-year-old state. I've got to do whatever I can to please mum. I've got to do whatever I can to get out of this situation. And so I do. That's what I attempt to do. And in the process of doing that, I finish up acting like a 3-year-old, and I go away feeling all ashamed of myself and everything for being such a childlike person with my mum, feeling really upset and judgmental about it, not understanding that actually it is the 3-year-old's terror that I need to release. And when I release that, I will feel like I'm an adult now in my interactions with women, in the example that I've given. So a lot of times our fear we don't want to acknowledge because it feels quite like we're often quite little when it was created, and so we feel quite little when we actually start to experience it. And even just the process of acknowledging it requires a lot of courage and a humility that actually, no, I feel like a 3-year-old child in this situation. I don't feel like an adult 47-year-old male. I feel like a 3-year-old child. And it's quite hard sometimes to admit to ourselves even that we have that kind of fear inside of us. And so what we have a tendency to do is try to make out that it's not there and try to ignore that it's there. But in the process of ignoring it's there, it's the emotions we ignore that finish up creating most of our life. So that's the thing we need to bear in mind. If we ignore the fear, then the fear will come to dominate our life. And that's the issue that we face. So if you can start to allow the fears to be present, which requires courage, and that's why prayer is such an important part of that. So, long to God to let you examine and open up to all of your fears, and also understand that God can help you through every single fear you have, every single one of them. And once you have that kind of reliance on God, you'll find you'll deal with fear after fear, and eventually you'll get to the point where you've hardly got any fear left inside of you, and any emotion that comes up just comes up naturally inside of you after that without reverting into anger or depression. Yeah. Yep. Does that help? Yeah. Yep. So focus on the fears. Just pray about those. Aaron?